Okay, hi. Welcome everyone to Ask the Experts, Lessons Learned Scaling Manufacturing Automation. In this comprehensive Q&A, I'm joined by a panel of 6 experts with deep experience in developing and leading automation manufacturing by Fortune 100 companies who will discuss the most common hurdles and risks when implementing manufacturing information. First, let's go ahead and just quickly meet our panel. Real quick, my name is Jen Senwu. I'm the host and moderator, and I'm joined by experts from both Aspect Automation and NACS Inc. Let's go around the room, and I'll start with Peter. If you can just introduce yourself, what you do at your company, and just 2 sentences about your background.
Sure. Peter Oberst, and I'm in the applications group here. That means we write the quotes for the new projects, and been in automation for about 40 years now.
Wonderful. Robert, off
Yeah,
to you.
Robert Doty, Managing Director of the Devices Division. I have over 25 years of automation and device assembly experience.
Okay, Bill.
Yeah, Bill Tramberg, and I'm the Director of Controls Engineering for the Automation Group. So I'm responsible for the teams that do the electrical design and programming for the control systems on the machinery we deliver. I've been with Aspect Automation for 12 years and then been involved in machine building in various capacities for about 30 years.
Wonderful. All right, let's go to John.
John Guion. I am the Director of Mechanical Engineering for the Automation Group. Like Pete, I've got about 40 years of experience. And our group is really responsible for helping to develop the overall system concepts and execute the mechanical portions of the equipment.
Wonderful. Over to you, Russ.
All right, my name is Russ Hubrick. I'm the Controls Engineering Manager at NACS. I've been in automation over 25 years. I manage at NACS the electrical and control or software engineers.
Awesome. And last but certainly not least, Jesse.
Hi, I'm Jesse Neiman, Mechanical Engineering Manager at NACS. I've been in custom automation for about 17 years and actually started my career at Aspect Automation and then moved to NACS.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. So we've got a tight-knit group here. Okay. So to the meat of our kind of Q&A, in preparation for this deep dive, we compiled a series of comprehensive questions for our subject matter experts to answer, sharing with us lessons and tips they've learned from their many, many, many years in the industry. So we're going to kick things off, start with question number 1. Feel free to chime in, but I'm going to start with, what are the most common pain points companies run into during the manufacturing process? I'm going to start with you, Peter.
Sure. So one of the things that we've experienced, and I'm sure others have as well, is as you're developing these machines and these systems, it really starts with what are the customer's expectations and their written requirements. We know, it's been said, no one is served by a soft set of expectations, and we really, the firmer the requirements, the more directly we can address those with our equipment solutions. So that's really important, that they know really what they're asking for, and that what they're asking for will solve their problems. So often in mechanical or in medical device in particular, the automation equipment is being developed as the product is being developed, and so that the two meet at when they're FDA approved and they can start producing and selling these products. So we find that as the product is being developed, sometimes the processes to assemble or produce those products will change as well. And that's another pain point, I'll call it, with trying to do those two processes in parallel rather than serially.
And Robert, are you also kind of seeing the same thing in your background as well?
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I would add on to, during the assembly process and evaluation, that a lot of times we see things missed, like max min material conditions. If you're putting two parts together and something's on its material condition and something's on its max material condition, those parts don't fit together. And so really at the early stage, understanding the the capabilities of the machine so that you can, and of the part design to make sure that it's actually manufacturable.
Gotcha.
You know, just like Pete and Robert are talking about, one of the other items is that if they develop this on a manual platform and they don't take automation into account and they go for FDA approval, they're freezing or putting into an effect a freeze on their product that isn't necessarily compatible with automation, or it can be that way. So as much as there is potentially a pain point like Pete's talking about, you know, have a soft requirement, there's also a pain point if they don't consider the end game. You can end up with a situation where it's very difficult to automate.
That's actually a good segue to kind of the goals for scaling manufacturing automation, you know, improving efficiency, reducing costs, quality, increasing production capacity. But what are some industry benchmarks that you've seen as meaningful goals to measure these against? I'm going to kick that back off to you, John, to kick us off.
So probably the most common is overall equipment efficiency, and that's, you know, generally we would start out at 85% for that target. That would be considered world-class for most situations, but there are certainly other elements that go into that. The availability, which would be the uptime, the performance, which is usually associated with the rate of the equipment, and the quality, which would be maybe the yield. Those three multiplied together should provide an overall equipment effectiveness of 85% or better. Now, there are some situations where that metric needs to be higher or potentially lower, given, I'll say, the particulars of the situation, but that's very common. It's a very common element that would be used to benchmark, and we do that with our FAT process and our SAT process.
And Bill, are you seeing the same things on your side as well to what John was discussing?
Oh, sure. I mean, like John said, OEE it's a standard that we all measure machinery against. It's the percentage of perfect performance, essentially, that a machine is achieving. Beyond that, I mean, it's not only our customers' standard for us that we have to meet when we deliver equipment. We build those calculations right into the equipment so the customer can measure that performance over time. It's important that machines usually work really well when we first deliver them. Over time, as a customer goes through different circumstances and products and whatnot, you know, that performance may deteriorate. And it's a good measure that when that OEE starts dropping down to 70 or 65, they have a problem, and we can then react to it.
Great, thank you. It's interesting. Okay, on to our next question. This is sort of a kind of a multi-pronged question. First off, for those that don't know, what is a business feasibility study, and how long does this typically take companies, and what do you typically require upfront to perform this assessment? So I'm going to actually start with Robert, but feel free for other folks to chime in.
Yeah, so a business feasibility study is a kind of a scientific experiment to prove that you can do something or not do something, and that something like this can take anywhere from 2 weeks at a very small feasibility up to maybe 24 weeks if it's a complex portion of the machine. And the whole goal of this is to burn down risk. So you're looking at maybe $1 million machine, you want to take a portion of it and spend maybe $50,000, maybe $150,000, and burn down risk so that we have success at the end. And a big part about that is we really want to understand what the client has done to prove the process already or disprove the process, so that we understand what has been done. And we really, really need to know what success looks like at the end of this feasibility, and when is it time to stop the feasibility if it's not feasible, and recalibrate and set expectations.
And I would imagine that this is timing wise very dependent on the customer's business, not their technical kind of tests, but their actual like business. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Anything others want to add to the business feasibility study before we go on to our next question?
I think the root of doing this is, like Robert said, is we want to retire that risk as early as possible. When you look at the overall schedule for a project, the earlier you can retire that risk, the more confidence everybody has in executing that project, which turns into efficiency, right? If there's lingering questions on how you're trying to get something executed, you have to think through every step, every time you get to that step. And if the risk is retired, then you have a confidence to say, yes, we can go this way. It's going to be a good outcome, and everybody can execute more efficiently.
Wonderful. Okay, so this question's for, I'd like Russ to tackle first. What factors do you typically look for in deciding which tech and or system integration vendor to collaborate with on automation solutions? I think sometimes the term I think you're using is system versus component level, but yeah.
Yeah, so they both kind of share the same process. It's identifying the requirements, getting samples to the different vendors for either the component or system, going through an iterative process of testing to make sure that the component system meets the requirements, and then going through a selection process after that. Component wise, it's a little easier than system wise. Say a vision system's one of the easiest ones to pick on. It'd be identifying different vendors that can, based on past experience, or if they serve a niche industry for the inspections we're trying to do, and then again getting the samples out to them, going through that iterative process of testing, reviewing the testing, and making a selection off of that.
And is this process, is the key point of this also to provide the lowest risk for the customer?
Yes, and that's part of this
Gotcha.
testing up front. So as we're going through that, we're trying to identify the solution that's going to fit the problem the best.
Gotcha. Great. Question for John. What is typically the longest step in this scaling automation process versus the shortest step? And can you give some examples of why?
Sure. So I would say that it's very situational. It's project dependent, and there's a lot of factors that go into custom automation and getting the solution that the customer needs. And I would say typically some of the longest steps might be engineering definition, or it could be that the engineering is pretty well, decided, and then it might be procurement, or it can be a combination of things. An example would be we built a piece of equipment for a multinational global company, making a very small medical device, a simple medical device, but small, 28 different SKUs, and they had SMEs from around the globe. So bringing that information together and getting alignment between their SMEs and what they wanted the future to look like was part of the challenge, but they couldn't do that without actually doing development. And the original process of what they required or asked for, we were looking at a project that was about 74 weeks long, and they needed something in 52 weeks. So the risk here was that we needed to build equipment, and their SMEs are not necessarily aligned, but how do we get them aligned? And so we decided to take a parallel development path, and we had the main machine to build, but we couldn't wait until the end of that process to then start doing the development. So we built test stands. There were 16 stations on this machine. We built the test stands, and each of those stations went on to a test stand, and we got the SMEs to meet us at our location, bring that information together, work with the actual hardware that was going to be going on to the machine, and look for what changes needed to be made. So in that case, it was really a knowledge gap that needed to be addressed for the overall system, in being creative and how you can address that was the requirement. So it's very challenging at times, but there are options if we explore it.
I have a general question actually for all 6 of you. On top of everything that you do during this process, do you also play a big role in as a kind of like a project manager? Is that on top of kind of everything you do, out of curiosity?
Well, I'll jump in here. Certainly every project has a project manager that is personally responsible to execute that work.
Gotcha.
As directors and leaders, we're kind of, our job is to put the right chess pieces in the right places so they can be successful. Certainly we have executed as project managers in the past
Right.
on these activities, but it takes a dedicated person who is solely responsible for completing those projects on time, on budget.
And they
Gotcha.
really, and project managers will, they'll serve as the voice of the customer to our organization, and they'll serve as the voice of our organization to the customer. That communication to facilitate that interaction and make sure everything's going smoothly.
Right. Very clear-cut role. Cool. Okay. Question for Jesse. What's an example of a prototype use case? And could there be more than a few involved in a project?
Yeah, so a prototype use case is something that we're going to use to burn down the risk of what are the risk areas we've identified during the business feasibility study. So there's been, a part of the process that's been identified as high risk. We feel that the rest of the project is, a good fit, but we want to ensure that we don't get too far down the path and get to a roadblock. So we will concept a solution for this problem at any given point in this process, and actually build either a small station or even an entire portion of the automated equipment and test that out to prove our theory. We could be using products available for manufacturers that are kind of outside their intended use slightly. We want to make sure that we can hit the rate. We want to make sure that we can deliver on the quality. So testing that out beforehand allows us the time to gain confidence before the rest of the system is built. And if there is a problem with the concepted solution, it gives us time to pivot and come up with a different method of attacking the problem.
And I know that we talked about there could be a few prototypes. Out of curiosity, for my knowledge, is there a max ceiling of prototypes that are created during projects like this that
not necessarily? It probably depends on the overall size of the project, but there could be anywhere from 2 to 5, maybe even up to 10 areas of risk that could be prototyped relatively simply to burn down that risk.
Interesting. Bill, a question for you. In terms of training and skill development, what do you typically see as the biggest kind of learning change curve for customers?
Yeah, that's interesting, because a new piece of equipment can be kind of disruptive and even intimidating for the people that work in the facility where that equipment's going.
Right.
So we encourage our customers to involve their personnel in our project execution, right? Even sometimes in the design process, to sit into design reviews and offer us feedback. Some customers send their people out here when we're in the startup phase and the testing phase of a piece of equipment, so they could run the machine and get their hands on it before it shows up at their facility. And it helps a lot with their understanding of the equipment and their buy-in and acceptance of it.
What are some examples of potential risks or challenges to implementation? Why are they so risky? I want to start with John first.
There are many ways in which risks come to a project, and we've talked about some of these things like the question just before on the training and skill development. If their skill sets aren't, if the customer wants to implement automation, but they don't have the skill set to support that automation, there's a potential risk there, or there's a challenge to that implementation that needs to be addressed. They either need to develop that skill or outsource that skill in some cases. The other things are, if the product we talked about, if the product is frozen prematurely and it's not automation friendly, how do we overcome that? And it can be a lack of knowledge or information that isn't quite yet available. So we have an example of a medical device company that was looking for automation, and they had done some searches, and most of the other automation companies were like, you know what, you don't have this product finalized, come back when you have that done. And we engaged, and in that process we did the evaluation, the risk assessment. This was a 10 to 12 machine process, and we were supplying 6 of those machines. But looking at that overall system, we identified 13 risks that needed to be dealt with technically. There were certainly some other risks, but looking at the potential challenges of where they were at in their process, there was concurrent product development occurring. We just looked at those overall process, took the overall process, looked at each step and said, these are the areas that are undefined, that need further definition. Identified 13 of them, like Jesse had said earlier. There were some that were 2 weeks. The longest one turned out to be 8 months. But we successfully retired those risks, developed that equipment, and installed that actually offshore, and is supported by our company even in that location. So all in all, a very good way in which to address the risk and bring it to closure.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'd
go
like
ahead.
to add something to that too. John kind of
Yeah,
mentioned
please.
this as well, but the product itself, the design of that, if it's not designed in a way that's automation friendly, it presents a huge challenge to automating the assembly of a device or a product. Things that are easy for a human to put together aren't necessarily easy for automation to put together. There's a lot less flexibility in automation. There's not as many degrees of freedom or processing power that just a human has. So understanding different methods of feeding products, parts, handling parts at the design phase for that product can provide massive returns down the line when a company goes to automate that process.
I was actually going to ask you in particular how big of an impact is for in the design stage if it's not designed for automation, and I was assuming that it's a big blocker.
Yeah,
so that's like good validating to hear.
Yeah, it can be the difference between being able to implement automation and not.
Got it. Wonderful. Okay, next question. What are the benefits of virtual simulation to test the automation plan? Bill, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. I mean, at its core, simulation lets you try ideas and concepts without committing to a physical build, right? That's the basic advantage of simulation. But beyond that, it's also a great communications tool. and we can present a concept to a customer in a very dynamic way that helps them understand it quickly and gives good and fuels feedback from them that we can then incorporate into the concept relatively quickly. So that part of it helps quite a bit. It's also able to allow us to compress the engineering cycle quite a bit in that most of these tools, simulation tools, will allow you to attach logic to the models so that we can actually write control code against the model and test it against the model rather than waiting for the physical machine to be built. So it lets our programmers get a jump start and test some of their code weeks or even months before they normally would be able to. So that's another big advantage as well.
Interesting. How can companies avoid major pitfalls when implementing automation? Is it better to look for a vendor that can walk the customer through everything rather than, go through, different partners? Want to kind of call on Peter and Robert to tackle this first.
Sure, I can start, Robert. So why would a company go to an automation partner rather than do it themselves? First of all, well, because they don't have those skills, right? Most of the time, customers are very good at their product design and their process, but not at equipment building or in automating those processes. So beyond the things that we've already discussed about design for manufacturability, you want to find somebody with the experience, with the knowledge, the scale that can handle the programs that some of these that our customers are going after, and they do it with selecting a partner is probably a bigger, one of the largest components of being successful. And they go through. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. And to add on to that, I mean, I just think that, a partner or like us who has over 40 years of experience has seen a lot of processes, implemented a lot of successful processes. There's things like safety on a machine that is so critical and so important to the operators that are interfacing with that machine. And it's just, there's a lot of experience that can be applied and reapplied.
Gotcha. Okay, for this next question, we're going to go back to Bill and Russ. What data points do you monitor to optimize efficiency, bottlenecks during the monitoring and optimization process? Russ or Bill, if you want to tackle that first.
Typically, you start off with cycle time as being the largest one. And then it also goes down to part quality. If you have inspection systems on there, monitoring those, the outputs of those as well for part quality, and then any other testing on the system. We have standards for calculating OEE on the machines. I think John had mentioned before, where 85% is world class. So I think both companies here follow that process where we monitor those benchmarks and determine the effectiveness of the equipment.
The overall cycle time of a machine is going to be a function of the individual devices and stations. So we trend the individual devices, individual modules, see where the bottleneck is, and then use that to focus our efforts to improve.
Pretty straightforward. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, we're down to our final question. We're going to start with Jesse on this one, but I'd love others to chime in. What's the most important component to successfully scaling an automation strategy in your own POV?
Well, I mean, the most important component of scaling would be actually scaling. Say you've got a roadmap. 5 years down the road, you want 10 million parts a year. Don't jump in and right away and ask for a machine to do 10 million parts a year. Start smaller. It may be better to start off with one machine that does 2 million parts a year and then duplicate. So 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, you add a machine a year and you end up with your 10 million parts a year. What that does is it gives everybody, you as the product owner and the automation developer the chance to learn. It's custom automation is not an exact science. So there's a lot of assumptions that get made. There's a lot of engineering that has to be done. And mistakes happen and things don't go as planned. And you use this scaling as an opportunity to learn and improve. So, you build Gen 1, and then by the time you do your second machine, you've got some little tweaks and changes you want to make to it. And you keep doing that process. And by the time, you get down to that 10 million annual part production, maybe you've optimized your equipment to a point where it actually does 3 million parts a year with slight process tweaks. That's not something that you're going to get by jumping right in and
Right.
going after 10 million parts a year right off the bat. So yeah, starting small and working your way up is definitely a huge, important piece of the process.
And to add to that, I mean, we often try to put a certain amount of modularity in designs when we know there will be a future need greater than the initial need. So that just means that we're going to design the equipment in a manner that will allow adding on and even moving around in the future without a real big redesign of the equipment. Just adds flexibility, and it also allows us to build modules with tried and true components that we know will work and reduce our risk.
Yep, and redundancy as well is another big advantage there. So you have one machine go down, you still have 3 more that can give you partial production.
Yeah, and I would like to piggyback onto all this. I think this is a great question, and it really ties in all the previous questions. And I think a real key takeaway is partnering early. And what I mean by that is a lot of our customers will refer to automation suppliers as vendors, and we don't like to operate that way. We like to be a true partner. And why that is so important is the life cycle of an automation project and really commercially launching a product. And it starts with some of the topics we talked about, like design for manufacturing, prototype production, maybe a manual line, semi-manual line, semi-automated, or fully automated at some point when the risk is burned down. And then that goes into a validation state where we have to do IQ, OQ, PQ, we have to do process characterization. And then we're at a point where we can launch that or get it to the FDA and approve. And it's so critical that we sit with our customers and partner with them and apply the right capital at the right amount of time. Instead of, like Jesse mentioned, marketing might have a $2 million or 2 million annual volume goal. And there's a way to get there, but it might be over the course of years. So let's, instead of spending $10 million today, let's spend $1 million. Let's vet this out. Let's prove the process. Let's get commercially approved. And then we will take our automation resources and scale either through what was mentioned. It could be next generation automation. It could be duplicates of lines. It could be a number of different avenues, but we'll apply the right capital investment at the right time to really take our customers to market.
Now, I know it's not, oh, go ahead.
And I would say
yes,
to add on to what Robert's saying is the partnering part is so important because when you're looking at something that's a longer term goal that might be 5 years away, you need to start with the end in mind and then take reasonable incremental, and I'm going to say converging steps to get there. If you like Jesse said, try to jump to the end, that's not necessarily good. But the other thing is, if you don't consider the end game, if you don't consider the automation of where you're going to go when you start, you can get started on a path that's very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. It's certainly not apples to apples, but in the line of work that I do a lot of performance marketing work. A lot of the themes that this panel has said around starting small, working your way up, we have something very similar. Basically a crawl, walk, run approach in the things that we do, because we have to vet similarly and then work our way up. So it's been interesting and very fascinating to hear a kind of this side of the the world that I'm not quite too familiar with. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And that, unfortunately, question concludes the end of our interview questions and Q&A panel. We really hope that all of the folks that are watching this gain some valuable learning, some insights and tips from our session here. I want to thank all 6 of you again for your expertise and your time. I know you're all very busy. Yeah, we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.